Hello and welcome everyone. This is Human Rights in Business 201, specifically looking at the food, beverage, and agriculture industry. My name is Michaela Lee from BSR, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Nestor, also at BSR in our San Francisco office. This is the second in our 7 webinar series on human rights in business. We've done so in a collaboration with Business Call to Action, looking at some of the impacts and opportunities related to human rights for a variety of different industries. If you look back at some of the other recordings, our first webinar training was an introduction to Human Rights 101. We have a number of other industries that we cover in our other webinar series, and then we have one specifically looking at the issue of privacy and data protection. Today we're going to look at a number of key human rights issues that are relevant for the food, beverage, and agriculture industry. These include forced and child labor, right to health, right to water, land grabbing and concessions, food security, and then we'll cover a couple of case studies. And for each of these areas, we'll provide an overview of the issue, a few cases and examples, and then some guidance and recommendation on what business can do. Briefly about your presenters today, my name, Michaela, I'm a manager in human rights at BSR and have been for 3 years, and I work with large multinational companies on how to understand human rights, the human rights impacts of the company's business, and how to build management systems that address those human rights issues. My colleague Peter has joined me. Peter, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Very briefly. Thanks, Michaela, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. Director of Human Rights at BSR. I've been here for 7 years, work across industries with companies on a range of human rights issues, including through several of our collaborations on human trafficking and other subsets of the human rights field. Looking forward to getting into the content today.
Thanks, Peter. So on our next slide, I'll share a little bit of information about BSR, which stands for Business for Social Responsibility. We work globally. We have offices in the U.S., in San Francisco and New York, but we also have offices in Europe and in Asia. And we work on a range of corporate responsibility and sustainability issues, including climate, women's empowerment, human rights, and others. You can learn a little bit more about our organization on our website at bsr.org. And while we don't have anybody from Business Call to Action with us today, I want to share a little bit of information about the organization. Business Call to Action is a global platform working with inclusive businesses, particularly looking at growing in low-income and vulnerable communities. They have 200 member companies that they work with on a variety of inclusive business issues. And specifically looking at what is an inclusive business, the definition that Business Call to Action uses is that an inclusive business is a commercially viable business model that benefits low-income communities by including them in the company's value chains as clients, consumers, producers, entrepreneurs, or employees. And today, as we go through some of these human rights issues that are relevant for the food, beverage, and agriculture sector, we want to look at what these human rights issues mean for businesses writ large, but also especially how it overlaps with this concept of inclusive business. You can also learn more about Business Call to Action on their website. So just before we get into the food, bev, and ag specific information, I want to share a little bit more about what human rights are and what are we talking about here. Sometimes human rights issues are really obvious. We've got a couple of images on the slide here that may give some illustration to what human rights violations are. Human rights violations like slavery, forced labor are pretty well known and obvious. Child labor is another one that is known to be a human rights issue and known to be an explicit violation of human rights that businesses try to avoid. And when we talk about the responsibility for businesses to respect human rights, some of these severe violations of human rights like forced labor and child labor are clear areas that a company may want to address. But there may be some other human rights issues that are less obvious. Ones like the environmental impact of using pesticides. Sometimes working and living conditions of employees come up. And these are additionally human rights violations, but companies may also want to address them in order to avoid reputational impacts, legal impacts, and others. So what are human rights? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is what we think of as the code of conduct for humanity. It lays out baseline expectations for how we treat each other. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that lists these out has been around for 70 years, 70 years this year actually. There is a lot of other legal language that's been developed, treaties and documents that lay out more details about what human rights are. But often going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes very clear what governments should protect and what businesses should respect. So as we talk about business and human rights in particular, the UN Guiding Principles provides the best guidance and interpretation of what human rights efforts should look like for business. It really provides a blueprint for companies. Before the establishment of the UN Guiding Principles in 2011, the concept of human rights mainly revolved around the idea that countries and country governments had a responsibility to protect. There's a state duty to protect and safeguard human rights. But the UN Guiding Principles laid out something for a little bit more nuance for business, this idea that businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights and that they should know and show what their human rights impacts are and the steps that they take to mitigate and eliminate human rights violations. So as we get into what it means for a food, bev, and ag company to respect human rights, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Peter Nestor, who will take us through the specific human rights issues for this industry.
All right, very good. Thank you, Michaela, for that introduction. So we will be going through a few slides here relatively quickly and taking on a number of issues in the food, bev, and ag industry that are commonly identified as human rights impacts for companies working in that industry. This is not an exclusive list. There are other issues that may come up given various geographic factors or other operational factors. But this should give you a good overview of some of the key issues. So we'll start with forced labor here, which is, as we talked about on the top right part of the slide here, prevalent in the fishing and seafood industry, but really across a number of different commodities: palm oil, sugar cane, cocoa, all provide well-documented cases of forced labor. Why does this happen? This is a very difficult, complex issue involving a lot of different social, political, economic factors in countries where there is an extensive amount of forced labor. One thing I want to be sure to clarify here is what exactly we're talking about when we discuss forced labor. So the definition here from the ILO is a little bit wonky. Forced or compulsory labor is all work or service which is extracted from any person under threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. Basically what that means, if you boil it down, is that if somebody cannot leave their job voluntarily, then that constitutes forced labor. It can be a threat, right? So it doesn't mean that people are shackled to their desks or that they are physically not able to leave. Often, you'll see here down below in this list of different kinds of practices that constitute forced labor. You'll see things like debt bondage or withholding wages or excessive wage reduction. Can also constitute forced labor because it makes a threat to people, or it puts them in a situation where they, in reality, cannot walk away from a job given the extremely serious consequences if they do. So I just want to make sure that as we're using a number of different terms here to talk about forced labor, what we're really talking about is the inability to freely walk away from a job by choice. We mentioned a couple of the industries where we've seen this before, but there are some very well-documented cases in the fishing and seafood industry. Human Rights Watch and others, Amnesty, have done great work into identifying and uncovering instances of forced labor, particularly in South Asia in the fishing industry. Sugarcane is also another industry where we know, certainly in South America and other locations where forced labor occurs. Palm oil is another one, primarily again in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, that part of the world. So if you are operating in any of those commodities or industries, then there's a good chance that you might have some forced labor in your supply chain, and it's definitely worth investigating. What exactly can you do, or what does that investigation look like? Let me start with just a couple resources here on the right-hand side of the slide, and these are available publicly. I would point you to the SEDEX guide right in the middle, and then also the U.S. Department of State Trafficking in Persons Report. The latest version, I think, is 2017, and it identifies countries that are producing certain commodities that are at a high risk for having forced labor. It's a well-researched, well-documented report, and it will get you started to just see if somewhere in your supply chain you might have a forced labor or a risk of forced labor. In terms of when you're actually doing the investigation, what are the kinds of questions that you should be asking? And again, I would point you to some of these free resources that are already out there. The ILO has a few. Marks and Spencer has put up a modern slavery toolkit that has a number of different self-assessment questionnaires that are publicly available. A group called Stronger Together has done the same thing, and you can work with them and steal a lot of their great work and not have to reinvent the wheel. But to make sure that you are covering your bases, it's important to ask whether or not workers have possession of their identity documents or other travel documents at all times. That's another instance where a worker may wish to leave a job or wish to leave a certain circumstance but cannot because their identification documents have been confiscated or withheld. I would also encourage you to interrogate that particular issue a little bit closer. Oftentimes you will get a response from employers that they are withholding passports or travel identification for convenience for the workers so that they won't lose them, or that so they don't have to worry about whether or not they will be lost. But that is a clear violation of international law on this issue, so and unacceptable from a business and human rights standpoint. So don't necessarily just take whatever answer you may get from an employer if you do find that there are some identification documents that are being withheld. And again, consult some of the resources that are out there in terms of what to do or how to engage with that supplier or business partner so that they can stop that practice. There are some emerging good practices as well around how to do that. If the workers, moving down this list here, if the workers are hired through a recruitment agency or broker, they might be subject to unlawful fees, recruitment fees, and other fees that make it very difficult for them to repay and constitute a form of forced labor. Debt bondage can be another similar way that a financial penalty can be hanging over the head of many workers who are already in a vulnerable situation. It's also been important to make sure that there was a contract that was signed between the worker and the employment agency or the final employer, and very important that the worker actually understood that. One good way to question that is to see whether or not the contract was translated into the worker's language. If they're coming from Nepal and going into the Middle East, then the contract should not be in English. It should be in Nepalese, and there should be translation services that are provided. So that's a very quick overview of a very complicated subject. Let's move on to another quick overview of another complicated subject, child labor, where in many cases what seems like it might be an obvious solution to just immediately prohibit children from working in an agriculture setting if they are discovered may not actually be the right answer or the best answer from a human rights standpoint. This particular issue is one that should be treated very carefully. If you do find it or suspect that there's child labor in your supply chains, it is very important to consult experts working on this issue or some of the resources out there which we provide in this desk as well. Again, we're talking about the instances of child labor across the food, beverage, and ag industry. Almost all raw materials and commodities will, in some locations, have instances of forced labor. Lots of reasons why this happens, equally as complicated as forced labor, and usually involves a lot of social, economic, and political factors behind the businesses, right, that are employing these people. The big trick here is trying to determine the difference between light work, child labor, and then the worst forms of child labor. Light work, children between 13 and 15 may do light work. Children under 13 under ILO guidelines are prohibited from working at all. And so that is important, even if it is a local family farm. But light work is permitted for children between 13 and 15. And any hazardous work cannot be conducted if they are under 18. And then sort of the worst form of child labor, so work that is likely to jeopardize children's physical, mental, or moral health or safety morals, is prohibited at any age below 18. So again, more resources available online over at the ILO. They do a nice job in some of their frequently asked question documents of laying out what the different requirements are. We've talked a little bit about where this is, highlighting here that cocoa is a high-risk industry. Seafood as well as palm oil all have very well-documented cases of forced labor. Resources on this slide for businesses, and then some questions that you can ask as you do your investigation or due diligence here. The remediation question is the big one. So, all right, we have discovered it, we found it, what exactly do we do? The advice that I would provide here is to do a lot of local engagement and trying to figure out exactly what other alternatives are available for children who might be found working in those locations. In many cases, they are earning some money for families that otherwise would be below the poverty level or at the poverty level. They often may be asked to not work at one farm, but then go to another farm because there are no structural remedies that will allow them to go to school, for example, or stay at home, or their families are unable to find jobs for a lot of different reasons. So while you don't want to necessarily continue to employ them, it is important to develop some kind of a long-term plan or a strategy or some way where it's not just going in and necessarily asking them to leave immediately. It's just usually much more complicated than that. So, a couple different things to ask as you're getting in here. Are there any children working below 18? And asking whether or not they have a valid ID system or a birth certificate system so that there can be some verification of age for each of the people involved. Are there schools or other vocational education resources that are available around the community or not? And then are there any grievance channels or mechanisms that are available? Often children might not know how to use them or what they are. They might not be designed with children in mind, but they can be, and they should be. If there's permissible work happening, so children doing light work under the age of 18 on some farms is okay, but it is very important that they do have access to some kind of a grievance channel where they can have a voice and make sure that if something is going wrong, they know who to call and how to improve their situation if needed. So again, just a few resources here and some things to think about on child labor. Getting into the right to health, what we're talking about here, of course, is health and safety working in the fields, but where we often see it come up is in the use of pesticides or fertilizer, or where there's other lack of personal protective equipment, PPE, or other safety equipment for farm workers. Everyone from the Universal Declaration, as Michaela mentioned earlier, everyone has a right to standard living and adequate health and well-being. The right to just and favorable work conditions is also one of the key articles. So the impact here is pesticide, health and safety issues, other contaminated materials, and there are some indirect impacts as well. So pesticides may spread through wind and water, impacting surrounding communities, or there can be a sort of, burning on, the WebEx thing is getting in my way. Fuck. Okay, sorry. Just saying that that there's also burn methods for clearing land that can result in haze influencing neighboring communities. This has been a really big problem, again, in Southeast Asia. And here we have a picture of smog that is coming primarily from clearing palm oil fields in Indonesia and has impacted communities across Malaysia and Singapore. Other examples on this slide around highly toxic pesticides and just statistics around how many deaths and health situations pesticides can cause. That's one area that a lot of different businesses, regardless of your size, can start to investigate and see if there's ways that you can change or swap in different pesticides that are considered to be less toxic than others. So yeah, a couple of questions that you can be asking here. First one is on pesticides. Are you aware of what you're using? Next is to think about PPE and other health and safety equipment and make sure that all of that is up to speed and up to par, and make sure that your suppliers are also have and are providing good health and safety equipment to people. Can smallholders be trained in sustainable agriculture practices to reduce the use of pesticides? So not only looking again in your own operations on pesticides, but asking your suppliers to be concerned about it and aware of it. And are food products tested to ensure they're safe for consumption? That's a little bit farther down the value chain, or getting out of, once the products are processed. And then are there any health concerns among local communities? So anything around burn rates or noise rates or dust incursion or water usage is another really big impact from agriculture. And actually the next one that we'll be taking a look at. We've added one slide here just on a very simple standard investigative process that aligns with the guiding principles in terms of conducting human rights due diligence. It's not rocket science. A lot of it is just getting out there, asking good questions, some of which we provided on these slides and in the other resources made available on this portal. But there, and then taking steps to remedy or think through a particular remedy whenever you find a particular issue. So investigating, identifying serious violations versus less serious violations. One may require terminating a supplier. Another may require just more training or awareness raising internally. And some be provided to victims, although we've talked about different forms that can take for really complex issues like child or forced labor, and then identifying ways to prevent future violations so that we're not just stuck in the same loop or cycle of human rights, negative human rights impacts from occurring. So making sure to just onboard and look forward about building some of these protections into your management systems. The right to water is actually the right to access clean water and sanitation. The second bullet point here, I think, encapsulates why this is such a big issue for the agriculture industry. Agriculture accounts for about 70% of water withdrawals worldwide. And there's also then the water discharge or the use of pesticides or other chemicals in the process that is then discharged into water and can create problems in lakes and streams and other communities that can contaminate water that is used by local communities. Obviously, a bigger problem regions. Many of those regions are also provide some of the most arable land in the world, and so a lot of agriculture operations can occur, but do take a lot of water. And so if you are operating or if your supply chain operates in one of those regions, it's imperative to get in there and take a look at what the water usage looks like and what management plans are already in place by your business partners or your company to manage water usage, try to reduce it, make it more efficient, and make sure that you're not polluting lakes and streams and other water sources. We've got a little bit of just a sort of a path here of how this happens. I think actually it's going to be more helpful if you take a look at this on your own. I want to just get to a couple of other questions here and then move into some case studies as we work through the webinar. So here, what are the different ways that you can investigate your water usage? So one is designing cost-effective measures for preventing pollution and mitigating risks of polluting water. Make sure that either you are assessing local water resources and then what your impact is on those local water resources, or you're using work that's already been done by a local government or another international business or local business that may have already conducted some kind of an assessment. This is a critical thing for all businesses to do. Going into a community and using water in a way that limits other people's access to it is, in fact, as we've talked about, a human rights violation, and it's a really critical one. So not one that companies often think of, and often think of this as just an infinite resource, but that's not the case. It is important to limit and optimize use for water crops, in water for crops, become more efficient in water usage, and to limit and optimize the type and amount of fertilizer or pesticides, and again, to swap out ones that are more toxic for less toxic and more sort of natural-based pesticides. We've got some guidance over here from the FAO, from Greenpeace, and from Nestle, who have done a lot of work on the right to water in assessing their own operations and trying to figure out what they can do to improve. All right, moving into our next issue here, land grabbing and concessions. This is often impacts large-scale land acquisitions, and one of the ways that this happens is not usually a business that is grabbing the land, but if you look at the last bullet point on this slide, it's governments who are working with business who can go in and use the power of eminent domain or other governmental powers to oftentimes combine a lot of different parcels of land, purchase it or force the sale, so purchase at less than market prices or force a sale at less than market prices, and then turn around and sell that land to a local investor, to a local company, or to a foreign investor who may be looking to set up an operation there. So that is considered land grabbing. It's in many cases considered a violation of the right to property, which is contained in the UDHR and elucidated further in other international documents. Lots of different human rights impacts, just looking at the second bullet point here, in terms of what happens or what the human rights impacts are of when land grabbing occurs. Indigenous rights are often infringed upon. There can be forced displacement, resettlement, and or significant harm, or even death to local human rights defenders or environmental activists who may be trying to protect or enforce the protection of indigenous land. We do highlight here that some aid donors or other international institutions can be involved in this. It's an issue that has occurred in the forestry sector all over the world, palm oil, other cocoa, banana plantations, so almost any kind of sugarcane recently, almost any kind of commodity or agriculture crop can be involved. The trick here is to really look at where you are operating and whether there's a history of the government conducting land grabs, or there's a risk that they are conducting or could be conducting land grabs in terms of some of the dealings with foreign companies. For you, even if it's not in your direct operations, it could be in your supply chain, and it's something to look into as you're doing your due diligence on your supply chain. Here it's what to do. Again, we've got some resources here on the slide that we'll need to update actually before we submit this deck for the final draft. But there are a number of different things that you can do to help small-scale farmers, right? So make sure they know their rights, make sure they understand what land grabbing is, and make sure that they are empowered to not sell their land at less than market prices, if that's possible to do. It may be the kind of thing where you need to call an expert or call in some other local institutions, law enforcement agencies, or try to work with other businesses or reach out to other businesses to see if there's anything that a collective action approach can take. Again, pretty complicated problem and not one that often one company can solve on their own, but one that most companies should be aware of. All right, food security is our last issue here. The idea here is that there is just not enough food to go around, and part of that is not necessarily the fault of the food, bev, and ag industry, but is rather an opportunity. So trying to think about how industry players can advance this right and maybe realize this right for people around the world. There's a lot of different science and technology that's going into making food security a reality. There are a number of different human rights opportunities we've indicated on the slide here that can be mitigated or hopefully eliminated as we go forward if we can solve the food security problem. A couple examples here and just some facts around food security. So 821 million people were malnourished in 2017, which is actually an increase from 2016. 151 million children under age 5 are affected by growth stunts. Climate variability and climate extremes are a driver behind some of these issues, as well as population growth and the increase in and just the increase in the sheer number of people on the world. So again, nothing really that you can do to mitigate this as a company, but it's important to think about how your practices are contributing to this, and it's a way that the food agriculture sector can help to advance human rights. All right, a couple of case studies here before we close this webinar, and wanted to just highlight a couple companies that are doing some good things, and also just to show that not all companies are perfect, not any company is perfect. There are some challenges that every company still has, and just to highlight what those might be for these particular companies. I should note that BSR has not contacted these companies or investigated them. This is all based on publicly available information. This one is called Equator, Kenya. They provide bird's eye chilies, and they are bringing in a number of different smallholder farmers into their supply chain and providing them with better technology, better training, and linking them up to global markets. What we're showing here is that they've increased production by 54% while improving the quality and reducing their water impact. They have created more water-efficient systems and also switched over their pesticides to more sustainable pesticides that are more environmentally friendly and safer for people. They have a good focus on women entrepreneurs as well, and have provided some resources and training to them. So all of that is really, really good, very positive, all good contributions advancing human rights. The questions that we would have is just whether or not they are still, are they using good PPE, and do they have all of the right basic health and safety precautions in place? We have no reason to suspect that they're not, but that would be one area that would be worth following up on. Finally, coming over to Ghana is a group called AACE Foods, and they are, again, considered an inclusive business with the BCtA, and bringing in a number of different small-scale farmers and suppliers into their business, and then using their platform to sell those products at an international level. They are also creating sort of better food and looking to provide more healthy meals, which is in some ways getting at the food security problem, certainly from a malnutrition standpoint. And again, focusing on developing business skills and entrepreneurial skills for women and helping to educate them on malnourishment as well. So all of that is really good human rights work. Again, the question here is, as they're continuing to do their own investigation on these issues, is where are they sourcing their raw ingredients from, and are they aware of what some of their business partners are doing? And oftentimes what you'll find is that the really good companies are doing really good work, but aren't necessarily aware of what their business partners are doing. And that is part of the guiding principles and part of doing really good human rights work. So congratulate, AACE and some of the other companies doing good work, and hope that all companies can take inspiration from that to continue down the journey of embedding human rights in your company. All right, that is it for us today. Thank you again for joining, and feel free to reach out to myself, Michaela, or anyone over from BSR, or anyone over at the Business Call to Action for any follow-up questions or resources. Look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.